Thank you, everybody. So glad to see everybody get up this early. I will promise to give you a good show. Indeed, I just came back from Antarctica. I was there January 20th to February 10th, a 26-day trip on a sailboat in the very rough Drake Passage. It is the stormiest seas of the world. And I was with 11 Polish sailors, captains, owner of the boat, and 3 Americans, my girlfriend Emily and one other American. And it was a rough journey getting down. We were a little late getting going because the keel was 5 meters long. It was stuck in the mud in the town of Ushuaia. Ushuaia is the southernmost city of the world. I bought a vehicle in Santiago, Chile, and drove about 7,000 miles through southern South America. And I invite you all to come to my workshop called The Mysteries of South America at 4:15 today, where I will be going over a lot of very interesting subjects, and many of them dovetail into Antarctica, most especially what happened to the Third Reich after World War II. There is an Antarctica component, there is a South America component, and it's very intriguing, and it's like the layers of an onion. The more you peel off, the deeper it gets. Well, we got out to the Drake Passage just around 3 o'clock on the second day. We left around midnight, so we were already a day late. And I suppose that's why the captain made a calculation that we would catch the tail end of the storm and get down there faster. Well, we got down there in record time, about 92 hours to get to the South Shetland Islands, but we caught that storm, and it was an 11 out of 12. Yeah, anything over 12 is hurricane force winds, and you better call the Coast Guard. That's an SOS. So it was the roughest seas I've ever been on. My dad owns a sailboat, and I've been on many trips in the Caribbean and the Great Lakes. And I knew this was a solid boat, but the Polish crew and captain, well, it was their first time. And we sustained about $6,000 in damage from a couple waves that hit the side of the boat very hard. So hard that, well, first of all, as soon as we turned onto the Drake from the Beagle Channel, and the Beagle Channel was nice and calm. There's penguins jumping, dolphins. You could see them coming from miles around. I'll show you some things about wildlife. It's just totally spectacular how there's no fear of humans down there. It's amazing. And it seemed like a pleasure cruise when we were on the Beagle till that next day when we turned down the Drake. And within 90 minutes, we were all throwing up. All but about 2 or 3 people on the ship, including our captain, fortunately, made it through because we needed him. I don't know how many of you have been seasick. Okay. In fact, 50% of all the people that go, even on the cruise ships, get seasick going to Antarctica. The Drake is the stormiest seas of the world. And it certainly was in our case. And what happens when you're seasick, first of all, for me, 2 days worth of food, gone. And then you can't eat. But the funny thing is you don't get hungry either. So anybody want a crash course diet, maybe consider the Drake Shake. It'll get you there. I lost 25 pounds. I'm still 15 pounds lower than I was a year ago. So it stays off. And another weird thing is my appetite has not come back yet. Maybe like 70% of what I used to eat. It's just I'm just not that hungry anymore. I don't know if it's still a result of that, but nonetheless, it was very stormy seas. And then when we arrived, we got to this place. This is called Arctowski Base, and it's a Polish base, and our captain and crew had set up this meeting. And each time we went to one of these research stations, we had a whole abundance of fresh fruit and vegetables, and they were so happy to bring that in, because that's the one thing they don't get from the supply ships, or not as frequently as we were. And this is a whalebone. This was an old whaling station, and I'll show you some other old whaling stations and tell you the devastation about what happened to the animals. Now, as Tony said, a year ago, when I was right here at Contacting the Desert, how many of you saw my presentation on the anomaly of the giants? Well, I made the announcement that I was coming to Antarctica at that trip, and some people didn't believe me. Now they do. And it turns out I had an apartment in San Francisco. It was a no-fault eviction, an owner moving to my building. So when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. That's what I say. And so I used the opportunity to do this trip, which I have been thinking about doing for a long time. And the way it all came together was quite spectacular. And that's my two presentations this year about that. Now, concerning these anomalies, as Tony said, I was going down to research the 3-mile craft in the ice, perhaps several. I was going down there to investigate antediluvian civilizations, including pyramids that may be sticking up through the ice, as well as any reports of UFO ET activity. For the most part, I was unsuccessful getting any real information, but there were a few things I did learn, and there are some deep mysteries down there. So the way I'm going to do this presentation, I'm going to tell you about some established science, which is also very interesting, things that the scientists are working on at these research stations, and also what is speculated, those topics I just mentioned. There's a saying that there are things we know now that once we didn't know. There are things we don't know now that we will learn one day. And are there things we don't know that maybe we will never know? And that's the enigma of Antarctica. It is truly one of the most curious, inhospitable, and unworldly-like places in the world. On the left is the recently completed reference elevation model of Antarctica. This shows you the elevation. Antarctica is the tallest elevation continent in the world because of 2 and up to 3 miles of ice over the polar plateau. And that's mainly in the East Antarctica side. And this is a good time to give everybody a little geography lesson, because this here is the laser. Here we go. This is, of course, West Antarctica. This is where we were, just in that region. This is all East Antarctica. Keep in mind, Antarctica is the 5th largest continent in the world. It's larger than Europe. It's twice the size of Australia. It's 1.5 times larger than the US or the lower 48 plus Canada combined. So I'll tell you, the distances are incredibly vast. So to do a real in-depth investigation of this continent would, A, take a lot of resources because it's not cheap to go down there, nor traveling all these long distances. And also to find this stuff is very much hidden. And I'll show you how absolutely there are massive chambers under the ice. And again, we're talking about 2 or 3 miles deep ice. On the right here is a new map that just came out from NASA. This red area where we were on the Palmer Peninsula is absolutely losing ice. There's no question about it. Some of the station chiefs that we talked to, one guy in particular in the Palmer base, he's been going there for over 20 years, and he said, you used to be able to see the mountains on Anvers Island, but the whole ice shelf is just dropping. And now you can see the mountains from Palmer Station. Penguins are changing their migration patterns. Cold water penguins, such as the Adelie, are dropping in numbers, while other opportunistic penguin groups, such as the chinstrap and the gintoo, which we were able to see up close, are gaining in numbers. They come from the Peri-Antarctic Islands, which just means like the outer islands of Antarctica. Now they're moving in. They're opportunistic. They're stealing the food. So although Antarctica is extremely cold, and the South Pole, of course, is in the middle of the continent, The continent is almost entirely encircled by the Antarctica Circle, much as we have the Arctic Circle. What that basically means is, in 3 weeks, when it is our summer solstice here, it's their winter solstice down there. So everything below the Antarctic Circle is pitch black, 24 hours of daylight. So where we were just 1 degree north of the Antarctic Circle, they're now experiencing 23 hours of darkness. And in 3 weeks, it'll be totally dark. So conversely, when we were there 6 months ago, it was 23 hours of daylight. That was also something that was very cool, to just still be light out at midnight, and then just a little bit of darkness around 2 or 3 in the morning, twilight, and then it's light out all the time. So we really got to maximize our time. So the interesting thing about this NASA map, and while you have extreme warming in red, you also have cooling and accumulation in blue. Somehow, and Linda Moulton Howe mentioned this in her talk yesterday, nature has a way of balancing itself. And I'll tell you, on my way back from this trip, I had a 12-and-a-half-hour layover in Miami Beach. So what did I do? I went down to the beach. No discernible sea level rise. You know the saying, water seeks its own level. If it's rising in one ocean, it will eventually rise all oceans. And I can't report that there is any sea level rise, and I live in the Bay Area, and that is also in one of these areas that is susceptible. Now, I absolutely know for sure glaciers are melting. Glacier National Park in Montana is soon going to have to drop that name because there's not going to be any glaciers left. If you've been there, you'll see diagrams or photos of the 1930s of these massive glaciers, and now it's just a little pack of ice at the end of the summer. Same thing is going on in Antarctica. There is massive melting going on, but there's also accumulation. So it's almost like Mother Nature, in her divine wisdom, knows how to balance this out. And that's a very fascinating anomaly. Now, there is no one country that owns Antarctica. There are claims, such as Argentina, and they're very proud of their claims, and they're also still a little bit upset over the Falkland Wars. Don't call them the Falkland Wars if you go down there, people. You might get in a bar brawl. They're Isles Maldivas. And they're up here, and I'm going to tell you a little interesting thing about the Falkland Wars at the end of this trip, and how it relates to the black goo, one other very strange anomaly of the southern part of this world. But Argentina then claims this chunk of the pie. But a very brilliant thing happened in the late 1950s, and it was a result of the U.S. testing nuclear bombs close to the New Schwabenland area, which is Queen Maud Land. We'll talk about New Schwabenland, where the Third Reich set up shop in the 1930s. And then we're doing nuclear explosions called Operation Argus in the 1950s. And as a result, plus other military expeditions and operations, the Antarctica Treaty was set up. And although 7 nations now have territorial claims, this sovereignty is not recognized internationally. But these 7 nations, interestingly, Argentina, Chile, you can see how they would make a claim, even the New Zealand and Australia, but the UK and France and Norway also make claims to Antarctica. But fortunately, these are just claims. And with the Antarctica Treaty, it was ratified in 1962. No one country can actually own. But you can set up a research station, and about, I think, 56 countries have them, including the U.S., 3 big bases, Palmer, McMurdo, which is the largest base in Antarctica, and the Amundsen Scott base at the South Pole. We were able to go to the Palmer station, and that's very difficult to get to. It's only because I'm an American and I was with 2 others, and our tax dollars go and pay for it, that I was able to make an appeal to the station chief, and he let us come in. And I'll show you Palmer in a moment. But they usually decline requests to come ashore, and they have that choice. They're a very serious research station. They're watching the penguin colonies. They're monitoring climate change down there, and it's a big deal. It's very important work they're doing down there, and it's only a skeleton crew of people right now at all the stations. Some of them are seasonal and close entirely. For the 5th largest continent in the world, there's only 1,000 people there right now. So it'll show you how vast and mysterious and desolate this whole place is. And here is a map of those bases. Most of them are concentrated in the Palmer Peninsula or up in the Shetland Islands area here. This is where Arctowski was. This is Ushuaia. That was the 92-hour sail trip over the Drake Passage. And then it took us 6 days to come back because we had to tack against the wind. But we got to see Cape Horn, which is the southern tip of South America. And some of the Polish sailors who had been planning to do this trip for years were so excited to go, were equally excited to see Cape Horn. I said, well, what's the big deal? It's just this rock sticking out. They said, well, just like every mountain climber looks at Mount Everest as being the holy grail of climbing. Thank you. There sure is. That one. Every sailor wishes to see Cape Horn because Cape Horn is the holy grail to sailors. It is the most dramatic sight. And like myself, many of you are probably immigrants to America. My family came through Ellis Island, and although my ancestors didn't do the Cape Horn trip, keep in mind before the Panama Canal, that's where you came through, that Drake Passage. The Beagle Channel is just right through the bottom there, but then the Magellan Straits, and I'll talk about Magellan and the 500-year anniversary at my workshop later today, including the Patagonian giants that Magellan encountered 500 years ago. But for Antarctica, you can see the dispersion of bases. Here is McMurdo, or the nickname is Mactown, Amundsen Scott at the South Pole, and that's Palmer there. And then the region we're going to focus on is up here. This is New Schwabenland. This is now called Queen Maud Land. It was renamed after the Antarctica Treaty, but if you guys come to my booth, I have a map from Nat Geo, pre-Berlin Wall coming down, and it still says New Schwabenland on the map. And I marked it up with some of the sites I'm going to show you here. But there are other claims, mostly in the East Antarctic side, and they all kind of take a wedge. Some of the wedges overlap, but are generally not recognized. So the Antarctica Treaty was signed in 1959 by 12 nations operating there at the time, and now it's 53 nations who have ratified it. And the brilliance of the Antarctica Treaty is that it ensures that countries that are active on the continent and surrounding islands south of 60 degrees consult on the uses of resources where there are no wars. So it's a demilitarized zone. It's a biosphere, not a national park. It's an international preserve. And part of the Antarctica Treaty states that you can do what I did. You can go down there. So it's a bit of a myth that I actually thought that it was going to be difficult. And people have been coming up to me and saying, well, weren't you restricted? No, we weren't. We were on a sailboat. All we did was get stamped out of Ushuaia by the Argentinian Navy, and that's a good thing. You want them to keep an eye on you. And then we were like in no man's land for 26 days. We were not recognized of being in any country. And so when we got down there, we had a Zodiac on the sailboat, and we could pretty much go wherever we wanted. There were no restrictions. There's no people down there, at least not in the a few places where we saw a station. It's like, oh, great, there's a station, let's go. We just wanted to see people sometimes. You realize how lonely it could be when you're, and we had a great crew. Everybody got along, there was no fighting, and they were a lot of fun, this Polish crew we were with. And by the way, we don't consider ourselves on a sailing trip as guests or as tourists. You're part of the crew. And as part of the crew, we were all required to take a 3-hour shift on watch. And that is strapping in to a life vest and a harness. And I'm telling you, you are as close as that edge away from death if you fall off. And on these stormy seas, the water is subarctic cold. You will die of hypothermia within minutes. And the way the boats are going in the rough seas would be very difficult. So I was up there on watch a few times after I started getting over my seasickness. For 3 days, my home was in that bunk. And when you're seasick, laying there is like the only relief you get. You're not really sick. But sooner or later, you have to go to the bathroom. It's like, oh, it's the most work you'll do all day. And it's like, how long can I hold it? and then it's like you get up and you're just bouncing over the cabin, holding on to everything, making your way to the bathroom, trying to get it down, sitting there, and then the movement makes you sick. So it's thrown up into the sink. It's doing what you have to do, getting zipped up in your cold clothes, making it back to the bunk. Okay, I don't have to move for 12 hours. It's like that. So there is a barrier of entry getting in to the white continent here, and it's not really that easy. But once you do, the beautiful thing is, it is this protected biosphere, and they're prohibiting mining. They're prohibiting, of course, whaling, or all the species are protected now. And, this is very important, no military operations. None. It's the law. And if any of these countries see you doing it, you're in trouble. Now, that's not to say there can't be covert activities, but it goes against the Antarctica Treaty if you do. So here's a couple shots I took. This is where we went. This is the Palmer Peninsula on the left, an area called Paradise Harbor, and it is extremely beautiful. If any of you saw my interview with Jimmy Church last night, he was asking me what it was like, and I was saying it's very much an alien-like planet. And the colors are just blue, white, and black. It's a lack of all primary colors except for blue. And I mentioned to Jimmy on the show, we were up on the deck of our boat one day, and I was commenting to Emily and Luke, the other American, how you just don't see any other colors. And my youthful indiscretion, I used to scuba dive. I went down about 250 feet in the blue hole in Dahab, Egypt. And that's way deeper than you should go scuba diving. And what happens when you go that deep? You lose all the primary colors except blue. The only colors you see are black, white, and blue. Same thing in Antarctica. So it's very much an alien planet. I'll get into a little more of that too, what they're doing there. This is Port Lockroy. This used to be a British research station. Now it's a museum. We see a lot of cruise ships. Cruise ships only go down for 6 days. 2 days over the Drake, which was half the time it took us on a sailboat. But we got 15 full days in Antarctica where they only get 6. And this is called the Lemire Channel. It's only about 1 kilometer wide and 15 kilometers long. They call it the Kodak Gap because so many people take pictures when they go down there. The southernmost continent and the site of the South Pole, Antarctica is virtually uninhabited, ice-covered landmass. The enormous amount of ice has formed through the accumulation of snow over millions of years, and it exists in a state of dynamic equilibrium. The amount of snow deposited in any one year is relatively very low. It is the driest continent of the world, too. Static electricity is a big problem at the South Pole because it's so dry. And it's also over 9,000 feet up. It's the highest continent, as I mentioned. Most cruises to the continent go to this area of the Palmer Peninsula. About 90% of the tourism goes by cruise ship. Very few get to go by sailboat just because there just aren't that many going. And I'll tell you, when we got to Ushuaia, I had no reservations. I had nothing. I didn't think I was going to be able to go because we went to some Antarctica half-price stores. And if anybody's thinking of going, you can go there on the shoulder season. That would be November or March, and get really good deals. You can do a cruise ship for about $6,000 or less. We got our passage for $6,000 a person, and that is actually a really good deal. Most are about $8,500. So we get down there, and it's right before New Year's Eve, and everybody's like, "You're coming right in the middle of high season, dude. I don't know what you're thinking. We're all filled up." And it looked kind of bleak. And then this is how things go. You just kind of have to be there, put yourself in the right place, and dig into the fabric, ask questions, and meet people. And my Spanish is not very good either. But we met a travel guide who said, well, there was one spot available on a sailboat. You should go down there and talk to the guy. And Emily, bless her heart, she says, you need to go. You go solo. I'll find something to do here. I'm like, no. We're going to figure this out. We're going to go together. So we go down there and meet the captain. And yeah, one spot. And he says, maybe we could squeeze into, but he wanted $8,600 a person. I offered him 10 for both of us, then 12. And I'm like, that's kind of the cap. Well, he had some other people, and that trip didn't work out, and it wasn't as nice of the boat as the Polish boat. And all the while, we're stepping over the Polish boat from Gdansk, Poland, it said on the boat, and eventually he's like, hey, they got some spots. So we met the guy on New Year's Eve, or right before it. We went to a New Year's Eve party at the Ushuaia Boat Club, and that's when I started my line of questioning. Do you know anything about massive craft under the ice? Do you know anything about antediluvian civilization? Do you know anything about pyramids or any ET sightings? And I was talking to seasoned captains who have been doing this every single year for decades. And this is when I started getting my no. One guy had been to Neuschwabenland. He's like, no, we ain't find the Baxes, mate. But I am looking for those little darts that they were dropping down from the Luftwaffe, and I couldn't find them either. But it's so huge that you could be looking right here, and what it is right there, and you not find it. So there are many ways to miss it. So I'm not saying that it's not there. I'm just saying we couldn't find people to identify it. So in addition to the geographic or geodetic South Pole is the ceremonial pole, where all lines of latitude meet. And that is where the Amundsen-Scott base, located right there. 2 maps, one from my lonely planet, just to show you 4 South Poles. How could there be 4? Well, there is that geographic South Pole that we all know about. There is also the geodetic, or the South Geomagnetic Pole. And this is where all of the southern lights, and I'll show you some pictures of the southern lights. We have Aurora Borealis in the north. They have Aurora Australis in the south. And there's a lot of references to Australis. Terra Australis is the name of the lost continent, because it was speculated long before it was discovered that there was a southern continent. But it wasn't until the sealers and the whalers sighted Antarctica in 1820. 1820. It's only 200 years since we've known that this continent exists. But I'll show you at the end some maps that show that perhaps long ago there was some knowledge of Antarctica. You also have the South Magnetic Pole. This is where all compasses point south, and this has been moving off of the continent. Just like the North Magnetic Pole is racing across the Arctic Ocean, it had been fairly stable around the North Hudson Bay area. It's now heading over to Siberia. This could suggest a pole shift could be coming up, and I will conclude this talk with some information on that. And finally, you have the pole of relative inaccessibility, and that is the farthest point away from anything in the world. It's the farthest point from any coastline and any civilization and anywhere. So, guess that counts as the fourth pole. And Antarctica is the world's largest active volcano system in the world. 91 known and active volcanoes, some of those under the ice. And I'll tell you what the implications of that in a moment. But here we are on Deception Island. This is another whaling base. Here you can see our boat coming in. This is a strait called the Neptune Bellows, named by those whalers and sealers of old because it's always blowing wind out of there. This is a sunken caldera. It's actually still an active volcano. We went over here and the sand was steaming. Had the tide not been coming in, we could have taken a hot spring, laid down in the warm water. We were in there with our bare feet walking around, coming up to see some old whalers who had passed away. This whole whaling station was devastated by a volcanic eruption in 1969 that basically melted a glacier, and it became like a slurry of rocks and water and just wiped out all these historic buildings. But some of the graves remain. This is actually an open casket grave still. I mean, things are so preserved. You still see the old rusty cans of food on the shelf and names that people who lived there many centuries ago. But beneath the icy exterior of Antarctica is a dynamic continental geologic plate. These tectonic plates are very much at work, and in places the continent is slowly being torn apart by the rifting, similar to that in East Africa. In fact, one of the fault lines is connected to East Africa. That's the one that goes through New Schwabenland. And I'll show you the Schumacher Ponds that were discovered by a German aviator of the same name, and that's where they built the New Berlin base, or Point 211. Most of the rifting takes place along the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, but there is a stratovolcano not far from McMurdo Station called Mount Erebus, which contains a permanent convecting lake of molten magma at 1,000 degrees Celsius, just a lake of lava in this volcano. It is truly the land of fire and ice. West Antarctica is where most of the volcanism occurs, in the front of the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. And this is one of those outer islands in the South Shetland group. So on this trip, we went to King George Island, which was Arctowski. Then we landed in Deception Island, and you can see the big protected bay here. Many shipwrecks right here, including some recently. There's a jagged rock that's only 2 meters below the water that has sunk ships as late as 20 years ago. So it still vexes sailors coming here. All right, they come from outer space. Antarctica is one of the most otherworldly places on Earth. It also turns out to be the best place to look for rocks from outer space. In early 1970, a few Japanese glaciologists discovered the first concentration of Antarctic meteorites, 9 pieces in all, near East Antarctica's Queen Fabiola Mountains. The discovery has evolved into a collection of nearly 50,000 specimens today. Our only current and continuous source of macroscopic extraterrestrial materials. Almost all the meteorites found come from Antarctica, and this is the concentration of sites where they find them. And the reason why you see so many located right here is because this is where the Transantarctic mountain range is. So just like all glaciers of the world, they are slowly moving, and when they get to the Transantarctic mountains, it's like they got to make their way through a gap, and then the meteorites are then concentrated in the gap and deposited at these sites. If the plan is to find objects that fall from the sky, then almost any rock found in East Antarctica has to fall there. Some are concentrated in places where the retreating glaciers have to squeeze through those narrow gaps. And that's where every season these glaciologists will come to look. And the season is only November to May. You can't be looking for meteorites in pitch black darkness. But then when they come around the next year, this is what they'll find. That new meteorites have come, and yeah, that's what they look like if you were to find one. And if you were part of the team, they treat these as specimens. So they're wearing gloves, they put them in airtight bags, and they send them off to the Houston Space Center because they are they don't know what they contain. In a meteorite NASA retrieved from the La Paz ice field in Antarctica, researchers have uncovered a grain of stardust that formed before even our sun had come into existence. What's more, the grain of material sheds insight into how solar systems like ours are formed. This is really exciting research these people are doing down there, and braving very cold conditions to do it. The investigators from the Antarctic Search for Meteorites program note that meteorites are rare scientific specimens, and outside of Antarctica, only a few are recovered each year. With the exception of a few lunar samples, meteorites are the only rock that continually occur, and you can see why. The whole continent is covered in over 99% of ice, so it's like a big white tableau, so anything that drops down there will be very obviously a meteorite. And of course, they test them to find out. Well, here's the most famous one of all. Do you guys remember when a meteorite was found with life from Mars a few decades ago? That was like the big deal, this soft disclosure. They're giving us little tidbits. Oh, we're finding life from Mars. Well, this is it. This is the ALH 84001 meteorite, and some NASA researchers have suggested that the Martian sample may have traces within it of ancient biological activity on Mars. So there's your Martian people. There's your little green man from Mars. Microscopic little creatures living in a meteorite that they found there. And like all Antarctica specimens, meteorites are collected only for scientific purposes and protected by the Antarctica Treaty. All these specimens are bagged with sterile tongs to protect them and then shipped to NASA laboratories. And then they're shared among scientists around the world who are interested in studying meteorites. So a part of the Antarctica Treaty is this sharing agreement that it is a continent that is reserved for science and research. And in fact, the Palmer base where we went is funded by the National Science Foundation. There is no military there at all. We didn't see any. And we were told that the military only acts as a backup. So if there's an emergency evacuation, it's possible for the military to intervene, or in the case of supplies or support. That's really all the military is supposed to do. So there are over 150 subglacial lakes which have been discovered in Antarctica, and many connect with under ice rivers. So these subglacial lakes sit at the base of large ice sheets, and they do remain liquid year-round. It could be because of the volcano keeping them warm. It could be that they're under the ice and protected from the freezing that way. But mostly they're because of the geothermal heating from the earth, the insulating effect of the overriding ice, and the enormous pressure of the ice overburden on top. This meltwater collects in hollows, as you can see here, forming the lakes in bedrock, indentures, and connected to other lakes by under ice rivers. So it is absolutely true that there are rivers and lakes that interconnect, and maybe that illustration of a civilization may be an illustration, but these subglacial lakes were only discovered in the 1960s, so this is a very recent phenomenon. And here you go. This is a map of what these subglacial lakes and connecting rivers look like. So there very much is an interconnection of rivers. And remember, water seeks its own level, so if it's melting from a volcano in the middle of the continent, it's going to have a river, it's going to have an outlet, because the warm water will melt its way through one way or another. There's one region here called the Lake District, and they're using side-scan sonar radar to detect these lakes. There's so many of them in this area, it's called the Lake District. Of course, they're all under the ice. And here you can see where Lake Vostok is. This is really fascinating. This is in the top 10 largest lakes of the world, completely under the ice. Lake Vostok is about the size of Lake Ontario, and it is much larger than any other subglacial lake. It's 50 kilometers wide and extends more than 240 kilometers, kind of this L-shaped lake, way deep under the ice. It turns out that the Russians have a base at the South Geomagnetic Pole right around here. So they were able to drill down there. You can see what a task that would be, coring through the ice 2.2 miles. They just did that in 2012. But it was a contaminated drill. They have to use kerosene to keep it from freezing. It wasn't until 2016 that they actually got a lake sample, and what they found was remarkable. They've already detected bacteria that has never been seen before, and the suspicion is it may be bacteria that lives on a kind of fish that lives in Lake Vostok that's totally undiscovered. So there could be life forms down here that live under the ice right now in total darkness, but you can imagine what it would be like in the summer, just this blue hue of light percolating down through the ice, but probably pretty dark. So the drilling is very difficult because the glaciers, they move around, and the drill bits sometimes get broken, and it's very difficult. So to get someone down there through one of these drill holes would be a monumental task. And where Lake Vostok is, it's 3.7 miles up. All right, here's our southern lights. Unlike the Aurora Borealis, which I saw in Montana one time, you can see sometimes at southern latitudes, the southern lights of the polar region are among the least seen ever, because there's just so few people down there. Really only viewed by a few hundred people each season, those overstays that are there for the winter. The auroras are named after the Roman goddess of the dawn, and millions of miles away, the way they're produced is the sun produces electrically charged particles that are blown outwards across the solar system in a continuous solar wind. As the solar wind passes the Earth, the charged particles are attracted by the Earth's magnetic field and are drawn to its two geomagnetic poles. As the particles pass through the atmosphere, they interact with atom molecules and ions in the upper atmosphere and light up into this display of light. And when seen from outer space even, they're quite amazing. And they take on different colors. They can even be blue, sometimes a hue of red. And the northern and southern lights actually occur simultaneously. We just couldn't see them when we were down there because it was 23 hours of daylight. But the Aurora australis holds this particular mystique because so few people have ever been in the position to see it, because the daylight hides it when you're there in the summer. So here is Palmer Station. There are 60 operating scientific stations of 23 nations. And it's funny, everyone you go to has these signs. Like everybody must miss home really bad because they post their little towns and stuff where they're from. This one's the Chilean base called Brown. This is a station here. The water is just so beautiful and blue. I told you I'm a scuba diver. To be up, we did this hike up this hill, seeing whales and seals like 100 feet down. This is our boat out here, so usually we'd have to radio in, and they'd give us permission to take the dinghy aboard. And all of them have little gift shops. I think I'm going to wear my Palmer swag on Sunday at the panel. Yeah, you know, the astronauts get to wear their flight suits. I get to wear my Palmer suit. So everybody has their little gift shops. You can go in there and buy patches or stickers or clothes. And this is the Palmer base. They don't connect the buildings because if one of the buildings catches fire, it won't destroy the rest. And it could be a while before you get relief. This is Bob Farrell, the station chief of Palmer. Here's Emily, Luke Dog, and myself. National Science Foundation welcomes you too. It's all paid for our tax dollars. So it is an advantage of being an American. In this case, we were invited to the Palmer Station. Didn't get to see too much of their research. Apparently, Lonely Planet, believe it or not, Lonely Planet produces a 250-page guidebook to Antarctica. Who'd have thought? But hey, I read that twice on this trip. Got a lot of my notes from it too. And they have these huge aquariums here. It was saying, he didn't let us see them, unfortunately, but all of the sea life. One of the boats that left port the day we did from Ushuaia, another Polish vessel called the Selma, we were on the Chief One, they were all scuba divers. Boy, was I jealous to do that. One day they let us come aboard their boat, and they were showing us some videos and photos. I'll tell you, it is as colorful and full of life in Antarctica as any coral reef in the world. I would have never thought that. But they showed us the pictures. It's just amazing. Sea anemones, little spider crab things crawling around, fan coral. I don't think it's really coral, but some colorful sea life. And because it is one of the cleanest oceans of the world and so prolific with life, it's just an upwelling of krill and other sea life, that the Southern Ocean is the fifth ocean in the world, by the way, is the most pristine ocean in the world. Another reason why the Antarctica Treaty is so very important. And although there are no permanent human residents in Antarctica, there is right now a winter population of about 1,000 people. This number increases on these stations to about 3,750, but by far the largest proportion of people that come here are tourists and the support staff of tourists. So we did the numbers, found it's only been since about the 1980s have people been going down there. Now it's up to about 300,000 a year will make it down there. If you multiply that, all the years that people have been going, divided by the population of the Earth, it's 0.002% of all humans on Earth have been to Antarctica. That's how remote and desolate it is. Another way of looking at it, the tourism season begins November until March. If Antarctica were 100 people, 56 would be tourists, 38 would be staff and crew, and only 6 are the scientists. So overwhelmingly more tourism and support staff than anything else. And one of the great things they're doing down there at South Pole Station is these very sensitive monitors. And I'm going to tell you more about South Pole when we get into the speculation part. But they have extremely expensive monitors which are watching these cosmic rays. This is a very new story I've been talking to Dr. Sala about. It's coming out of the Earth at a 30-degree angle. Usually cosmic rays are coming at the Earth. But this is coming out of the Earth at the South Pole, suggesting perhaps a large cavity, or like the neutrinos, which are passing through the Earth. And this equipment called the ice cube is highly sensitive and detects these things. And it's quite baffling to scientists, even still, why this is happening. And back in 2006, they just started discovering these cosmic waves coming out.